Hey guys, I'm Colin. Today we'll be replacing this oil filter housing on this F55 Mini Cooper. Let's dive into it. We'll be performing this DIY on this Mini with the B46, but this replacement also pertains to the B38 and B48 engines as well. The OE housings are known to crack and start leaking because of their plastic construction. Our replacement kit is an upgraded metal version to prevent future leaks from happening. Our kit contains a new oil filter cover, an O-ring for the oil filter lid, the main gasket to the back of the engine, and a new heat exchanger. We recommend using your favorite oil filter brand, as this comes with an aftermarket filter. Now, let's look at the tools needed to complete this job. Before we get started, here's some of the tools you're going to need to do this install. So we have a T55 Torx, we have a T30, we have a T40, we have an E10 E-Torx, a 1/4 inch 10mm socket, 3/8 10mm socket, 3/8 8mm socket, 3/8 17mm socket. We have a 32mm oil filter socket. We have a 4mm Allen for our ECS intake, assorted extensions, assorted ratchets. We have our pressure tester. We have a coolant system fill tool. You'll see how handy this is later. Assorted picks, and power tools aren't really necessary for this, but it does make this job go by a little bit easier. So with that, we can get started with our install. Our first step is going to be to disconnect the negative terminal on the battery. So pull back this weather stripping. Our battery is underneath of this panel here. If you have an aftermarket intake, it might bolt to this panel. In this case, we have the ECS tuning intake on it. So we'll just have to remove that bracket before we get the battery off. These bolts are removed with an 8mm socket. Now we'll use a 10mm to remove these plastic nuts. Now that we've removed our access panel, we can remove the negative terminal on the battery. This will be a 10mm socket with a short extension. Now that we've disconnected the battery, we can start removing all the things we need to remove to get to the oil cooler. So that's going to include this air inlet, this upper tie bar for the hood support, and this plastic piece here. So we'll get all that removed and we should have access to our oil cooler. We'll start with these 10 mils here. Now this should just unclip. There we go. Now we'll remove all of these T30s for this tie bar. Now that those bolts are removed, we can remove all the bolts for this upper tie bar. So we have 8 T30s for the lock support, 1 10mm for the air box, and 1 T40 in the center. Now we can remove our hood latch cables from the underneath. These should just pull off of the tie bar. During an install that takes a little bit more time, or maybe you have a lot of hardware, it's a good idea to have a hardware organization tray just to keep things organized in case you walk away from the job or it takes longer than expected. It's going to be removing our underneath splash shield. Now this Mini already has a skid plate, so some of the sockets and tools you'll need might vary from case to case. So as you can see, this car already has kind of a decent coolant leak. We've got some on the ground already. I suspect it's coming from that oil cooler because it is a really common failure point on this engine. So that's why we're replacing it. Gross. Now that we're underneath this Mini, we are going to remove the drain plug so we can drain the oil, and that is going to be a 17mm socket. Now that the oil is drained, we will reinstall our oil drain plug. Next, we'll remove the drain plug for the oil filter. This is going to be a T55. Now we can remove our oil filter housing. That is going to be a 32mm socket. Now it's time to drain our cooling system. So to start, we're going to crack the reservoir here for more flow. There might be a little bit of pressure in this if you just drove the car, so be careful. Now we can pull this upper radiator hose and drain our coolant. Now we will remove the upper coolant hose. So I'm actually going to detach it from this coupler here instead of doing it over here. Just because this car already has coolant everywhere down here, I'd rather have the mess consolidated to one area instead of creating more of a mess over here. So we can start by unplugging this map sensor here. Now we will pull this coolant hose off of this clip here, just so it's out of our way. Okay. Now that we have some things removed, we can use this mostly straight pick here to pry up on this clip for the radiator hose. So we're just gonna go in right here, hook under and pry upwards. There we go. Now we can pull our radiator hose off. So this is gonna create kind of a mess, so make sure you have some type of catch tray underneath the car to kind of catch all the coolant. So we'll just rotate and pull at the same time. Now that the coolant is drained, we can pull this hose out of the way, and we're just gonna set it kind of over here, just to give us more access. This part isn't really necessary, but I want these lines out of my freaking way, so I'm going to throw a zip tie on them over this harness, just like that. Now we're going to disconnect the harness for the fans, so just pull in on these two tabs here, should just pull right out. And then we're gonna move the harness out of the way, and then we can pull out our fan shroud. Next up, we're gonna use a T30 with a ratchet to remove this bolt for the fan shroud. This might not be necessary, but I'm going to unplug this sensor here, just to make clearance a little bit easier. Before we remove the oil cooler, we're gonna cover up one of the coolant lines so we can blow off with compressed air all the areas above and around the oil cooler. This is so debris and dirt doesn't fall into the oil cooler during this process. Now we're gonna remove this 3-bar plug that goes on the auxiliary coolant pump. This can be kind of tricky to remove, so if you want to use a pick to unlock it, then you can use the pick to gently leverage the plug off. You don't want to break it and have to repin a connector, so be careful. Now we're going to pull the auxiliary coolant pump out of this little rubber grommet here that holds it in. This is just so we can get easier access to this rear coolant hose right here. So we're going to disconnect that with our pick, swing everything out of the way, and then we should have access to the oil cooler. Now that we have our clip pulled, we should be able to just pull off this coolant hose with a little bit of wiggling. Lose a little bit more coolant, so make sure that your drain pan is still underneath the car. Now I'm going to pull off the auxiliary coolant pump. This will just give us a little bit more room to access our cooler. It's not completely necessary. Now we just have some wires that we have to unclip from our housing. So if you can see down here, we have this clip right here for this guy. There's one a little bit lower down, and then there's this clip for the alternator power. So we'll remove those, and we should be able to remove our filter housing. Okay. One more wire in that bracket. Okay, that one's removed. We will unclip this for the alternator. Move these up out of the way. Now we're finally to the oil cooler. We can start removing the 5 bolts for that. It is an E10 E-Torx. There is a certain order these bolts have to be removed, basically a star pattern, and we can show you here when I go to remove it. Something to note when removing these bolts, they're actually captive to the housing, so you can't remove them all the way. Now that we have some of our bolts cracked loose, this is going to continue to leak coolant, so basically during this whole procedure, just make sure that your drain tray is underneath so you're not making a huge mess. Now we can remove our oil cooler. Ba, 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 ba. So as you're pulling this out, you might want to be careful you don't damage your radiator. It's very easy to dent these fins or punch a hole in it if you're not too careful, but here's our gross oil cooler. Let's get it over to the bench and talk about it. We finally were able to remove our stock oil cooler housing, and you can see why these fail. So this gasket is split in half. The plastic housing is broken on the bottom side. This gasket is also split. So this is going to happen with something that's plastic over long periods of time because of all the heat cycles it goes through. It just breaks down. That's the nature of plastic. So this car had a pretty big coolant leak, and it was actually coming from this cooler. So during this DIY, we can also fix an actual issue with this car. This metal housing is going to prevent all of those issues from happening, and it's covered under our lifetime replacement warranty too. So let's get this thrown in the car. So now we're back over here on the car. As you can see right here, some of our oil cooler actually fell into some of these coolant galleys. So when you remove one that's as damaged as ours was, you're going to want to make sure that you have nothing in these when you put it back together, because that's just going to create a bunch of problems that you don't want. So we're just going to fish these guys out of here with a pick, just like that, and we should be good. Make sure you double check all of them though before you put it back in. And you're going to want to clean this surface up for the gasket. Before I install this filter housing, I would like to mention that it is a good idea to check bolt length and thread pitch. So you can see here, provided with our kit, we have 2 separate length bolts. That is because on this factory filter housing, you can see it sits like this on the vehicle. This bolt in the corner, right at the end of the actual filter housing itself, that is where our shorter bolt is going to go. You want to make sure that you put the shorter one in this hole, because if you put the longer one in there and torque it, you could risk cracking that hole, and you'll obviously leak oil from that. So let's get these installed with the correct bolts in the correct spot. Now we're going to snake this back in the same way we got it out, and making sure to not damage our radiator. And as you're putting this in, you want to make sure you route the wires the same way that they were when it came out. And shimmy this over here. So similar to when we took off this oil cooler, there is going to be a torque sequence. It just ensures that the gasket seats properly and you're not going to have any leaks. So now we're going to perform the torque sequence. So the first bolt we're going to tighten is this one on top. We will be tightening our first bolt, and we are tightening these to 8 Newton meters, which is not a lot because you can strip these out and you're not going to have a good time. Okay, bolt 4 is right next to bolt 3. Bolt 5 is diagonal. Okay, now that we have our oil cooler properly torqued, we are good to put this car back together. One last thing I'd like to mention before we fully put this car back together is doing a cooling system pressure test. Now, this isn't something necessary, but it saves you a lot of time and effort. So basically, we're just going to hook up this coolant pressure testing device to our reservoir after we buttoned up the cooling system, and I usually go to about 1.5 bar on the gauge, and I'm gonna let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes like that, just to ensure we have no leaks. So you don't wanna fully fill your cooling system and find out you have a leak and then you have to take the whole car back apart again. It's not ideal. So this just ensures things will go smoothly the first time. Now that we have our oil cooler installed, we can install a new filter. So this kit does come with a filter already installed, but in this case, we're going to use a nice OEM filter. Now it's time to top off our cooling system. So to do this, I'm going to use our Schwaben vacuum filling tool. This isn't necessary because these cars actually have a factory bleeder on the reservoir, but this just makes it go a little bit quicker and it ensures that we get all the air out of the system as fast as possible. So we'll get this hooked up and fill up our coolant. So if you'd like to learn how to use this tool, I can actually show you right now. So there's different rubber grommets depending on the size of your reservoir. So our kit comes with all kinds of different sizes. This, for example, is a 45 millimeter. The one that I am using on this reservoir is a 35 millimeter. So it just pokes into the reservoir like this, and you can turn this knob to make it tighter in the reservoir. Once it's sturdy enough to where it's not going to fall out on its own, that's how you know it's tight enough, and we can start pulling vacuum from the system. So before you start, you're going to want to make sure that both of these valves are shut. As you can see here, both of these are shut. Now we're going to take this tool and we are going to put it onto our fitting, and we're going to be hooking shop air up to this. Just like that. Now we're going to pull all of the air out of the system. I like to get a paper towel and put it in my hand and cover up this right here, just in case any coolant comes out and it quiets it down a little bit. So we're going to start by opening this valve, like so. I'm going to make sure this one is shut so you're not pulling air into the system. And then we're going to open up this valve for the shop air. So you'll start to see this gauge climbing, and that's it pulling air out of the system. So you're not going to hurt anything by continuing to let the gauge rise. I usually go until it completely stops. This ensures that all the air is pulled out of the system and we can fill it with coolant and not have to worry about air bubbles. Now that our gauge is pegged at -25 bar, that tells me that most of the air has been pulled out of the system. That's pretty standard for a lot of cars. Our gauge usually gets to that once all the air is pulled out. So now that we have it all evacuated, we're going to shut this valve off to retain the vacuum in the system. Then we can turn off our shop air and we can remove this from our fill tool. So now we will take our actual fill tool and put it into some genuine coolant. This is pre-mixed, so we diluted it 50-50 with distilled water. Now, once you have full pressure in this system, you're going to open this valve and it's going to suck coolant into the system and not introduce any air pockets. See, our reservoir is starting to fill up. And make sure you don't suck too much air through this tube. If you get a little bit, it's okay. Now we can continue. Now our gauge is at 0. That means we've filled the cooling system and pulled all the air out that we can. Now we can remove this tool. So we'll just pop this off of here like so. Let some of it drain into here so you don't make a mess. Then we'll open this valve and all the coolant will drain back into your container. Now our coolant fill is complete. The last step of our procedure is going to be filling the car with oil. When you start the car, you might have a low oil pressure light on. It will go away if you let the car idle. Don't be alarmed. If you put in the correct amount of oil per Mini, everything will be fine. So we'll add our oil, start the car, and this will conclude our install. The oil cooler housing, as well as the oil service kit and all the tools that I used during this DIY will be in the description below. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more enthusiast content.